The dog had been silent for 11 days. Not quiet, silent. There's a difference, and anyone who has spent time around animals knows it. Quiet is rest. Quiet is peace. What Sergeant First Class Harlan Boone's military working dog was doing in Kennel Block C at Fort Ellsworth was something else entirely. He sat at the back of the enclosure, spine pressed against the concrete wall, eyes fixed on the middle distance like he was watching something no one else could see. He hadn't eaten since they brought him in. He hadn't listened to commands to his name, to the sound of food hitting the metal bowl. The kennel techs had started leaving the bowl closer and closer each morning, trying to coax him forward an inch at a time, and each morning they found it exactly where they'd left it. His name was Scout. He was a 4-year-old Belgian Malinois, 72 pounds of muscle and scar tissue, with a nick in his left ear from a piece of shrapnel he'd caught in the Korengal Valley 18 months before Harlan Boone caught a bullet outside of a forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan and didn't come back from it. Scout had been on that mission. Scout had been the one to find Boone's body in the dark, according to the after-action report, and had refused to leave it until the extraction team physically removed him. That was 3 weeks ago. The extraction team brought Scout home. The Army didn't quite know what to do with him after that. The base veterinarian, a soft-spoken captain named Dr. Ellery, had filed 2 separate behavioral assessments in 11 days. Both said the same thing in different words. The dog was deteriorating. Not aggressive, not dangerous in the traditional sense, but unpredictable in a way that made the kennel staff nervous. He'd snapped at a handler who reached into the enclosure unannounced. He'd paced for 6 hours straight one night, wearing a groove in the concrete so visible that a tech photographed it and sent it up the chain of command without a note attached. Because what note could you write that would explain what you were looking at? The third assessment was going to recommend euthanasia. Dr. Ellery had told the kennel supervisor this on a Tuesday morning, standing in the hallway outside Block C with a clipboard under one arm and the look of a man who had not slept well. He didn't want to do it. Nobody wanted to do it. But a military working dog that had become a liability, behaviorally unpredictable, not responding to any handler, not eating, was, by regulation, a liability the Army couldn't maintain indefinitely. They had a timeline, 2 more weeks, maybe less, if Scout's condition continued to worsen. The kennel supervisor, a staff sergeant named Kowalski, had nodded and gone back to his desk and stared at the wall for a while. Then he'd made a call he wasn't entirely sure was within his authority to make. Petra Voss had been a trauma nurse at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center for 4 years, which meant she had seen things that would rearrange a civilian's understanding of what the human body could survive and what it couldn't. She was 31 years old, originally from Spokane, with dark circles under her eyes that were a permanent feature rather than a sign of fatigue, and a habit of getting to the hospital 40 minutes before her shift started because the parking situation was easier and the coffee in the break room was better than what she had at home. She had never planned to work with dogs. She had never planned on a lot of things, actually. She hadn't planned on spending 2 years in a trauma rotation that was 40% combat veterans. She hadn't planned on learning, slowly and out of necessity, the particular vocabulary of soldiers who came in not knowing how to say what was wrong with them, the compressed language, the habit of understatement, the way a man with a sucking chest wound would try to wave you off and say he was fine. She hadn't planned on getting curious about that vocabulary, about what it meant and where it came from, or on spending her off hours reading field manuals and after-action reports the way some people read novels, or on eventually taking a weekend course in military working dog handling that a colleague had mentioned offhandedly at a department barbecue 3 summers ago. She had taken it because it sounded interesting. That was the whole reason. She'd paid the registration fee herself, driven 2 hours each way on a Saturday and Sunday, and come back knowing something she hadn't known before. She'd filed it away in the same part of her brain where she kept everything she'd learned that didn't have an immediate application, knowing that eventually it might. Kowalski had gotten her name from the colleague who'd mentioned the course. He'd called her on a Wednesday afternoon while she was eating lunch in the break room, introduced himself, explained the situation in 3 sentences, and then said, "I know this is a strange ask." Petra had set down her sandwich. "Tell me about the dog," she'd said. She drove to Fort Ellsworth on a Thursday morning, her day off, with a travel mug of coffee and a notepad on the passenger seat where she'd written down everything Kowalski had told her and a few things she'd looked up herself. Belgian Malinois. 4 years old. Named Scout. Handler KIA 3 weeks prior. No response to handlers not eating. 2 behavioral assessments filed. She'd also pulled up what she could find about Harlan Boone. It wasn't much. A photograph from a unit newsletter, a mention in an Army Times article about the mission that had killed him, a few paragraphs about his service record. He had been 36 years old. He had spent 8 years working with military dogs. He had trained Scout himself from the beginning of the dog's service, which was unusual. Handlers and dogs were usually matched after initial training, but Boone had requested the assignment specifically. He'd called Scout the best working dog he'd ever been partnered with. The Army Times article quoted a fellow soldier saying that the two of them had an understanding that went beyond what you usually saw between a handler and his dog. Petra had read that line twice. She didn't know, when she pulled into the Fort Ellsworth parking lot and signed in at the main gate, exactly what she was going to do. She had a general sense that she was going to look at the dog and try to understand what she was dealing with. She'd brought a few things: a harness that wasn't military issued, a particular kind of treat that the handling course instructor had mentioned Malinois tended to respond well to, and a small notebook. She was not there in any official capacity. She was not a vet, not a trained handler, not anyone the Army had any particular reason to listen to. She was just a nurse who showed up because someone had asked her to, and who had decided, somewhere on the drive over, that she was not going to let a dog who had survived a combat deployment and the death of his handler be put down in a concrete kennel because nobody could figure out how to talk to him. Kowalski met her at the entrance to Block C. He was a compact man in his mid-40s with a meticulously maintained uniform and the wary look of someone who was not certain they hadn't made a mistake. "He's at the back," Kowalski said. "He's been at the back since Tuesday. We've tried 3 different handlers this week. He won't engage. Does he attack?" "No. He just shuts down, looks through you." Petra nodded and looked through the window into the kennel. Scout was exactly where Kowalski had described. Against the back wall, sitting very still, eyes unfocused. His ribs were starting to show through the short, dark fur. The food bowl near the gate was full. She studied him for a long time without speaking. "You can go in if you want," Kowalski said. "I'd recommend staying near the gate, though. Can you give me a few minutes out here first?" He left her. She stood at the window and watched the dog and thought about what she knew and what she didn't know. What she knew. Belgian Malinois were working dogs in the most fundamental sense of the word, which meant that their psychological structure was built around purpose, around partnership, around the specific person they were bonded to. When that person was gone, the dog didn't grieve the way a companion animal might, replacing one attachment with another after enough time. Military working dogs, especially one who had trained with the same handler for 4 years, especially one who had found his handler's body in the dark and refused to leave it, didn't transition easily. Sometimes they didn't transition at all. What she also knew, Boone had trained Scout himself. He had spoken to the dog in commands, in signals, in the particular language that military handlers developed with their dogs over years. That language was not generic. It was specific to the relationship. She opened her notebook to the page where she'd written the things she'd found in the field manuals. The standard command vocabulary for military working dog operations. The signals, the releases, the emergency recalls. She knew most of them. She'd learned them in the handling course. She'd reread them the night before. She closed the notebook and put it in her bag and went to the gate. She didn't go in right away. She crouched at the gate and waited. Scout didn't look at her. She watched the shallow movement of his ribs, the particular tension in his haunches that wasn't aggression, but was the body bracing for something it couldn't name. She said quietly, in German, "Here." It was the recall command. "Come here." Standard military working dog vocabulary, originating in the German Shepherd heritage that had shaped most MWD training doctrine. Malinois responded to it too, especially dogs trained in the traditional method. Boone had trained Scout the traditional way. She'd confirmed that in his service record, Scout's ear moved. It was the left ear, the one with the nick in it. It moved toward the sound of her voice, not turning, not lifting his head, just a small involuntary reorientation of the ear toward the source of a familiar sound. Petra held very still. She said, "Platz, down, stay." Scout's head turned. He was looking at her now, not through her, at her. The eyes focused, sharpened. His whole body shifted slightly, a subtle realignment that she recognized from the handling course as the posture of a dog coming online, coming back into the present, orienting to a handler. He thought she was speaking to him. He thought she was someone who knew the language. She was. It's not 40 minutes of commands. It's not 40 minutes of tricks or tests or demonstrations of dominance. 40 minutes of Petra crouched at the gate, speaking quietly in the German command vocabulary, and Scout moving. 1 foot at a time, stopping, waiting, moving again, across the length of the kennel toward the sound of her voice. He stopped twice and looked away, and she thought she'd lost him both times. She waited him out. She didn't push, didn't repeat the command, didn't escalate. She'd learned in the trauma rotation that the worst thing you could do with someone who was shutting down was push them faster than their nervous system could handle. You waited. You stayed present. You let them come to you. Scout came to her. He sat down 18 inches from the gate, on his side of the wire, and looked at her. Not the unfocused stare of the previous 11 days, but a direct, present, working look, the look of a dog waiting for instruction. Kowalski had come back at some point and was standing behind her. She heard him make a sound, not quite a word, just a sound, when Scout sat down. Petra reached carefully through the gate and let Scout smell her hand. He didn't move away. "How long since he's eaten?" she asked. "Yesterday morning he took a few bites. Before that, 2 days." She took the treats out of her pocket and put several of them on the floor of the kennel through the gate, close to where Scout was sitting. She didn't look at him while she did it. She turned slightly to the side and looked at the wall. She heard Scout eat the treats. She stayed very still. She didn't make a big deal of it. She just stayed there, present, looking at the wall, while the dog ate and then looked at her and waited. "Okay," she said quietly, to no one in particular. "Okay." She came back the next day, and the day after that. Both times on her day off, both times without any official status, any title, any authority to be doing what she was doing. She filled out the visitor log at the main gate, and Kowalski let her in, and she spent 2 or 3 hours with Scout, and she didn't try to accomplish anything beyond being there and speaking a language the dog understood. On the 3rd visit, she opened the gate and went in. Scout stood when she entered, alert, watching her. She walked to the middle of the enclosure and stopped. She didn't look at him directly. She kept her gaze slightly to the side, which she knew was less confrontational. She said, "Fuss, heel," and began to walk. Scout fell in beside her. Kowalski watched from the window for 10 minutes. Then he went back to his office and picked up the phone. She was not prepared for what Kowalski told her when she came out of the kennel that day. She'd been thinking about next steps, whether it would be possible to start working Scout with a new handler, who that handler might be, what the timeline would look like before he could be formally reassigned. She was already composing a conversation in her head, practical and logistical, and focused on what could be done. Kowalski was waiting for her in the hallway. He had a different look than he'd had before, not the wariness from the first day, but something heavier, more careful. "There's something you should know," he said, "about Boone." She waited. The initial report said he was killed in action. Hostile fire, enemy contact, standards, forward deployment risk. He paused. "Sid opened an inquiry last week. They're not saying it publicly yet, but I have people I talked to. The angle they're looking at," he stopped again. "What angle?" Petra said. "Friendly fire," he said. "Possible, but the ballistics are inconsistent with the position of the enemy contact, and the only person in range with that sightline was..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Petra stood in the hallway and thought about the photograph in the Army Times article. Boone's face. The way the article had described him knowing things about his dog that other people didn't know. The way Scout had refused to leave his body. "Where was Scout when it happened?" she asked. "Ahead of Boone. Point position. He would have been downrange of the shooter. So Scout would have scented." "Yes," Kowalski said. "That's what Side thinks. Scout knows who was there." The name that came up in the CID inquiry was a staff sergeant named Fowler, who had been reassigned stateside 4 days after the incident, a routine reassignment, on paper, except that the timing was what it was and the ballistics were what they were. Fowler was now stationed at a base in Georgia, going about his life, waiting for something that may or may not come for him. Petra was not an investigator. She was not law enforcement. She was a trauma nurse who had driven to Fort Ellsworth on her day off and learned that the dog she was trying to save might be the only living thing that could place someone at the scene of what was beginning to look very much like a murder. She called the CID agent, whose name Kowalski gave her. His name was Special Agent Dorsey. He was professional and careful on the phone and did not tell her anything she didn't already know. But he listened very attentively to what she had to say about Scout, about what scent-trained dogs retained, about the neurological basis of scent memory in working animals. She told him that Scout had not been formally assessed since his return. She told him that if anyone was planning to make a case, a dog with combat-level tracking training and an intact scent memory of the incident site might be more useful than the Army currently understood. Dorsey said he'd make some calls. Petra drove home and sat in her car in her own driveway for a while before going inside. It was 3 weeks after her first visit to Fort Ellsworth that the formal evaluation was requested. Not by anyone in the kennel, not by Dr. Ellery, but by CID, a request routed through channels that Petra didn't fully understand and that resulted in Scout being transported to a facility in Virginia where a behavioral veterinary trainee named Dr. Kaminsky spent 4 days working with him alongside a CID handler. Petra wasn't there for most of it. She got updates from Kowalski, who got them from someone else. She was at Walter Reed, doing her job, working a Tuesday night trauma rotation that brought in 3 vehicle accident victims and a construction worker who had fallen 2 stories and was going to be fine but didn't know it yet. She thought about Scout between patients. She thought about Boone's photograph and the way the article had described him. She thought about the nick in Scout's left ear and the 11 days of silence and the moment when the ear had moved toward the sound of the German command word. On a Thursday, Dorsey called her. "The evaluation confirmed what you suspected," he said. "The dog's scent discrimination is intact and operational." He made a positive indication, a pause, in a controlled test, which is admissible in the supporting evidence framework, though not conclusive on its own. What does that mean for the investigation? "It means we have something we didn't have before," Dorsey said. "It's not the whole case. But combined with the ballistics and a witness statement that came in last week, it's material. And Scout?" There was a brief pause. "The euthanasia recommendation has been formally withdrawn," Dorsey said. "The behavioral assessment was updated. He's been reclassified as ready for reassignment pending a suitable handler match." Petra sat for a moment with her phone in her hand, in a storage closet off the main hallway at Walter Reed, where she stepped away to take the call, surrounded by boxes of IV supplies and a corkboard covered in shift schedules. "Good," she said. She didn't say anything else because she didn't trust her voice. Fowler's case took another 4 months to move through the legal process. Petra followed it the way you follow something that you know about but can't control, checking in when she had information, not when she didn't, trying not to attach too much of herself to the outcome. Dorsey called her twice more with updates. The ballistics analysis was expanded. The witness statement was corroborated. Fowler had a lawyer and a theory about the timing of his reassignment and a gradually diminishing ability to explain the inconsistencies in his account of where he'd been and when. The case was built on a lot of things. Petra knew she was only one of them, and a peripheral one at that. She hadn't done anything dramatic. She hadn't broken rules or gone places she wasn't supposed to go or put herself in danger. She had driven to a military base on her day off and crouched by a gate and said 2 words in German to a grieving dog. But those 2 words had started something. And the thing that had started had, in the end, gone somewhere. Scout was matched with a new handler in November, a staff sergeant named Dillard from Fort Bragg, who had specifically requested a Malinois and who had the particular quality that good handlers had, which was a willingness to let the dog set some of the terms. The matchmaking process took 6 weeks and was overseen by the kind of institutional attention that military working dogs didn't always get, which was one of the things that Petra, later, was proudest of pushing for. She'd written a memo. Nobody had asked her to. She'd written it anyway, addressed to the MWD program coordinator, making the case that the behavioral protocols for dogs who'd lost handlers in combat needed to be revised. That the current timeline for assessment and the current standards for what constituted a viable working animal were not adequate for dogs in Scout's situation. That the knowledge base for working with traumatized MWDs existed but wasn't being applied, and that the cost of getting it wrong was not just an animal's life, but as the recent case had demonstrated, potentially more than that. The memo went up the chain. She didn't know exactly where it landed or who read it. But 6 months later, she was contacted by a lieutenant colonel in the Veterinary Corps who had been asked to convene a working group on MWD post-deployment behavioral standards, and wanted to know if she'd be willing to contribute her perspective. She said yes. The last time she saw Scout was in December, at a small ceremony on the Fort Ellsworth parade ground that nobody had publicized very much. A retirement ceremony for 3 working dogs who had been medically cleared and placed with approved adopters. Scout was one of them. His new handler, Dillard, was there with Scout. They stood together with the ease of a pair that had been working together long enough to stop thinking about it, Scout's shoulder against Dillard's left leg, both of them alert and calm. The adopter was Boone's sister. Her name was Catherine, and she had driven from Tennessee to be there, and she looked at Scout the way you look at something you've been waiting a long time to see. She'd applied through the official adoption process immediately after learning that Scout might be available. The paperwork had taken 3 months, and she had called the kennel coordinator every 2 weeks during that time, not to pressure anyone, just to make sure the application was still in the queue. Scout went to her without hesitation. Petra stood at the edge of the parade ground in her civvies, a November wind cutting across the open space, and watched Catherine Boone sit down on the grass right there on the parade ground, not caring about the uniform protocols or the ceremonies still technically in progress, and let Scout put his head in her lap. His tail was moving. It was the first time Petra had seen his tail move. She stayed until the ceremony was over and then walked back to her car. She had a double shift starting at 7 the next morning. She had a working group meeting in February and a memo to revise, and a colleague who had asked her to speak to a group of nursing students about trauma care in military contexts, which she'd agreed to do in March. She had a lot of things ahead of her. That felt right. She started the car and pulled out of the parking lot and drove back toward the highway, and the Fort Ellsworth gate got smaller in the rearview mirror and then disappeared. And she turned on the radio and let the music fill up the car. And she thought about a dog with a nick in his left ear sitting in the back of a kennel in the dark, and the sound of a single German word, and the slow turn of a head towards something that sounded, in that moment, like a reason to come back.